Katie, good to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining me today. Tell me a little bit about you and kind of what brought you to the leadership programs, the business programs, the graduate programs here at Point Loma.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation about these fundamental topics today. I think that they are not only topics that can be integrated into business, but also ourselves and our personal growth as people. So I always wanted to become a physician. So that was my dream.
Wow.
I can remember I wanted to be part of the medical industry with the hopes to make a difference in our society as far as preventative health. And when I went along that journey, life taught me many lessons along the way, and my purpose shifted, my vision for my career shifted, a lot of entrepreneurial projects and various workforce experiences and troubles and obstacles, but also some victories along the way. And around the pandemic time, I learned that I really just loved leadership. And I was very passionate about leadership in various forms of our community. For me, a big inspiration comes from health. I want to be part of changing the health of our world. I think that's a huge problem today. There's a lot of people struggling with all kinds of health concerns. So that was really the seed that planted first, and then that led me to Point Loma Nazarene. So I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to be learning and growing professionally and seeing what comes ahead after this experience.
That's very exciting. You know, when you talk about health, it's interesting because we live in San Diego, and so we don't see it a lot here, right? Everyone tends to be fit and good looking and dress well because they live in San Diego, right? But then when you think about on the global aspect, I grew up in the Midwest. I know, your heritage from a different part of the world. It's so much different outside of San Diego, right?
Oh, 100%, of course. There's so many communities, whether you talk about concepts of maybe either malnutrition or chronic illness, or even cancers increasing every year. And so that's a huge prevalent part of a lot of people's life. And we need leaders in that space.
Yeah. So what does that look like for you? I know we're going to get to our principles here in a second, but what does that look like for you? It's good for the class to kind of have a chance to hear from you as well. So what does that look like for you in terms of leading healthcare, health? What will that be 5-10 years from now for Katie?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew the answers to what 5 years from now will look like, but I know that I am determined to do a lot of things along the way until then. And so for me, what leadership looks like is really how are you showing up every day to be the best that you can be, not only for yourself, but for what you're trying to accomplish. So, whether that is in a corporate setting, let's say you're leading a team of people, how can you be the best version of yourself to lead those people, but also to support them so that they can flourish and evolve. So, in terms of healthcare industry, I think that there's a lot of people are afraid to speak up. A lot of people afraid to make changes, and it's a very, very money-driven industry.
Oh, big time, absolutely. Yep.
So, a lot of people may feel, I know I have felt it many times, that it's like, what am I gonna do? It's such a big industry with such power. How can I make a difference into it? And I think that it could be microscopic. If there's enough of us that can make microscopic changes, it can make a big impact overall. So,
well, it's going to be exciting to kind of see where it takes you. Like you said, it's such a fascinating industry you're going into, whether you're talking about a local hospital, public health, right? That's a whole nother thing that we could talk about that is on a global level. We've done some training, the consulting company I work with the CDC. Actually, we've done a lot of training with them. We actually got to go out there last August, and I got to kind of be on campus there. It is incredible when you get to talk to these people about their passion for public health and the issues that are out there in backwoods countries and cities and places, even in the United States. It's not even a global thing. It's right here in the United States as well, too. So very excited for your future in that. You mentioned leadership being the importance of showing up well with ourselves, showing up for ourselves well so we can show up well for other people. What does that look like And this will kind of lead us into kind of what we're going to talk about today, this idea of principles. But what does that look like for you? A leader, maybe an example of someone that you've seen in your lifetime, someone you've worked for, someone who's worked for you, someone who's been on one of your teams, who has shown up well. What does that look like in a practical sense?
Mm. I think a leadership could take so many forms. One of the most beautiful things I have learned working in team environments is that we all have strengths to us. And sometimes our greatest weaknesses can be our strength as well. And
Hmm.
so, uh, for me personally, on my own individual journey, the obstacles that I have overcome, whether it be personally or relationship or financial, regardless of the obstacle, I think those moments are the best moments because they bring out parts of us that maybe need healing or work. And so, in those moments, I think it's always good to step back and take those as opportunities to grow, evolve, and flourish. And so, with what we're going to be talking about today, I think it can be compartmentalized. For some, it might be self-reflection. For others, it could be faith, having a higher force that leads them towards um, greater good. Um, it could be structured of how metrics almost,
Hmm.
okay, by the end of this year, I want to accomplish XYZ. And so how can I measure that? How can I, try to aim for those goals?
Who's been the greatest leader that you've ever been on a team with or you've ever worked for? Are you willing to put that person on blast?
Yeah. I think there's been so many people, it would be hard to choose. I think there's been a lot of people throughout my life that I have been inspired by or humbled by. I can't help but think of really close relationships,
Mm.
friends, family, my mom. Uh,
Wow, that's great. That's huge. Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, yeah.
uh,
Well, so tell me about that. Like, how has your mom been a great leader? I always say that the greatest gift a person can have is to have, and we have no control over this, but the greatest gift a person can be given is to have a great father, have a great mother, right? So it sounds like you have a great mom. How has she shown you what leadership is?
oh, it's such a beautiful question. I wish
Mm,
just a rock star.
mm,
So I think, you know, I, I for me, I had the privilege of being raised by a mom. My dad passed away at a young age, and so uh, I saw her persevere and just
wow.
overcome so much struggle.
Hmm.
And I think that when you witness someone overcome struggle and rise above it, that can be very inspiring. How can that be a form of a leader? A lot of times in a leadership role, uh, you have to overcome struggle. You have to learn how to communicate. You have to learn how to uh, uh, persevere with others,
Hmm.
how to sacrifice, how to be humble. And so I think that in my case, I was very lucky to have a role model in my life that highlighted or showed those qualities. Uh, and so, yeah, I would say that.
So coming to what we're going to talk about today. This class, obviously, we're talking about integrity, and so in this class, with the three 1 unit classes, we've kind of looked at what I call the PVPVM. So you've got principles, values, purpose, vision, mission. And so this really is kind of the spear, right? This class right here is the spear. It's the tip of the spear where we're going to talk about principles and values. This podcast specifically is going to lead us into our first assignment where we talk about principles. If you had to name a principle, and again, for this, just for the purpose of this class, a principle is a rule. It's a rule that's unchanging, right? No matter what season of life we're in, we say this is something that I'll never ever break, right? So somebody might say my top principles: I'll never cheat, I'll never lie, I'll never steal, whatever those are, right? Um, when you look at your own family and how you grew up, your family system, friend system, school system, what was a principle that really stood out to you as you were kind of making your way through your own journey?
So when you think of principles, you mentioned values.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that for me, values is a huge, important aspect of my life, how I live. not only in my personal relationships, but even in a professional setting. And so one of I believe that when I reflect on this, one of my core values is really thoughtfulness. And so how I strive to be as thoughtful as possible of how situations are not only impacting me, but my environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say for me, that would be one of those.
What would that look like? So we're in a leadership class. So what would that look like from a leadership perspective? You're boots on the ground, you're in healthcare one day, you've got things flying past you, whatever it is, and you say that one of my so just for this podcast, I'll use principles just because we're going to get into values here in like 2 or 3 weeks. So if you say that thoughtfulness is something that you really that is a key principle for you, it's a key value, it's something, it's a rule that you live by. How does that play out in the workplace? Boots on the ground in a practical sense. How is a leader thoughtful?
So although sometimes in a work setting, you have to think on your feet and you have to be
Yeah.
quite, fast and quick. I think sometimes there's actually a lot of opportunity, although in disguise, to step back for a moment, look at the big picture and reflect and be thoughtful and considerate about choices that are being made. And so that could be a financial decision.
Mm-hmm.
That could be about your staff. That could be about many facets of business. And so, although necessary at times, like I said, to be quick, uh, I think there could be great value in taking a moment to be reflective and thoughtful about choices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good. One of the things that I think about, there's a great quote out there, St. Augustine. I don't know if I mentioned it in this class before, but he's got this great quote that says, "Love is seeking the highest good for the other person," and that's one of my favorite quotes. And even when I'm giving corporate trainings, I try to sneak that in, right? Because that idea of thoughtfulness, what you're talking about as maybe being a principle of value for a leader. Um, it really comes back to, I think, the greatest leaders. And if you think about your greatest leader, I think about mine, right? Great coaches, great teachers that I've had. And I've had great leaders, right? They won't, you can't say in the business community, you can't say in the business, you can't walk up to your employee and say, "I love you." But the greatest employers are the ones who show love, right? And it's that thoughtfulness, it's that seeking the highest good for you, right? Or for me, right? The person who's working for them. And I think that's something that we miss out on. Why is it hard for people to be thoughtful in the workplace? Why do you think it's difficult for people to be thoughtful in the workplace?
Sometimes multifactorial for sure, but sometimes I would say, you know, maybe they don't feel appreciated, or
Mm,
there could be many things, lack of pay,
hmm.
and not so great work environment in general, uh, deficiencies in relationships in the workplace, things like that. And so they, I think a lot of time it happens every day in so many business settings and work settings where people don't love their job. They don't love what they're part of. And so to come back to the purpose of a lot of these podcasts that we're doing in this class, I think that's why it's so important for people to reflect about their purpose and their value,
Yes, absolutely.
and
Yep.
to come back to why it is that they're doing the work that they're doing, so they
Hmm.
can bring inspiration within themselves to, accomplish the goals in the workplace. Sometimes we don't get that from our boss or from our
Hmm.
coworkers. And so bringing that out within ourselves, I think, could be of great value. But, uh, you know, again, and then also again, why it's so important to have good leaders. Sometimes leadership isn't the best. And so it's hard
Hmm.
to be inspired to work within an environment when you don't have good leadership.
Absolutely. And one of the things you said there, reflection, I think is so key. And I think we live in a world that's so fast paced, and reflection takes time, right? It takes
Oh, yes.
intentional. Do you reflect at all? Do you have any reflection practices that you do in your own life? Not to put you on the spot, but I journal, for instance. So I don't want you to think you're giving something I'm not asking. I journal. I do that. Matter of fact, today I spent some time doing that. Do you have any reflection tools that you have,
I,
that you use?
I do a journal as well. therapy. I love it.
That therapy is great. It's so important. Yes.
And just talking to friends,
Yeah,
listening to yourself, taking moments. Sometimes it needs to be scheduled. So prioritizing that.
absolutely.
And it is challenging because we all have so many responsibilities and so many things that we have to
Mhm.
attend to. And the world can be very challenging and tough. So yeah, I love that you brought up journaling, taking that time to reflect, to think, uh, and to be alone even,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and
Yep.
be with your own discomfort.
Yes, that's so key. Your own discomfort. And anytime we journal or go to therapy, or any of those things, it means we have to be uncomfortable. And I think that's why a lot of people struggle with that. And again, it's people like me who are going to have, I tell people all the time, I will have a job for the rest of my life because corporate America, nonprofit organizations, even, even healthcare organizations really struggle with this. Leaders coming to work unhealed, right? They haven't been reflective. So they bring that hurt and pain from whatever it is from childhood, from prior relationships, past jobs, whatever, and they're not able to lead the way that they need to. So I think that's a huge key, especially what we're talking about right now. Whereas next week, everyone in class is going to have to spend some time looking at the principles. That reflection piece, I think, is going to be so important. So here's what I want to do. All right, so let's come up with 3 ways, right? Because next week in class, people are going to have the assignment. They're going to have to look and write down 7 principles. They have to come up with that. I think at the end of our lives, we probably should have more like 100 principles. There's a great book out there called Principles by Ray Dalio, and he just keeps creating principles throughout his life. He's a billionaire. He's done incredible things with his business, but we're going to have to come up with 7. So now you talked about values earlier, and Katie, I'll tell you this. If you want to, you can come back and join me on the podcast when we talk about values, and we can talk about that as well. For this one, let's kind of talk about our principles. And principles are the solid rules. Like these are unchanging. I don't care if someone is 20, 30, 40, 50. If you're a nonprofit, for profit, principles, so these are the rules that kind of got us. And then as we get to values, values would be more behaviors, right? So what are the behaviors that I want to do? And I think a lot of people kind of get these, they interchange them, but I want to stick with the rules. So let's talk today about 3 ways that people can determine the rules so that next week when they're sitting down and they're figuring out, people might be lost is how do I figure out what my principles are? So what would be a first way that you might say, hey, this is how a person can find out what their principles are?
So to ensure I understand correctly,
Mm-hmm.
and you said we have to come up with 7 principles for today. And so
Mm-hmm.
these aren't values. They're
Correct.
more so direct, almost task-based, would you say?
Well, so I would say, see, it's good we're having this conversation because I think a lot of people, and I've done this class before where I didn't have a chance to do a podcast like this with somebody else. So people were writing values thinking that they were principles, and companies get this wrong, organizations get this wrong. So principles are rules, right? So um, and I'm trying to think what a rule might be. And I can't stand that word. I was such a rebel, growing up. So it was not a word that I liked very much. But I found the older I've gotten that rules are important. So a rule might be I get up every day at 5:30 a.m. no matter what. If I go to bed at 2 o'clock, like last night I was up late doing emails and stuff, but this morning still got up on time because that's a principle I have. Another principle might have, somebody might have is I don't eat sugar, right? Or I don't, no matter what. Right. This is a rule that I have. It's a principle. Values go into the behaviors. So the behaviors are like, I want to be courageous. I want to be thoughtful. That's a great value because then in a situation, a person can say, if they've got their values written out, which is what we'll do here in a few weeks, they can look at any situation and say, today, did I follow my 6 values? Did I behave according to these 6 values? Rules are like that. They just don't change. Values can change depending on the season, right? So if I'm 18, 19, 20, my values are going to look different than when I'm maybe 40, 45, 50 years old, right? So those might change depending on the season we're in. Rules just are unchanging, right? Does that make sense?
I believe it does. So let's say if
Okay,
we can test my
perfect.
comprehension here. So, we talked a lot about reflection. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Yep.
I wonder if then it would be appropriate to say that a principle for someone could be to self-reflect annually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like, so you're exactly right. And so I kind of see what you're saying about task based, right? It goes back to if I just say a rule, but I don't attach it to something, then what is it? It's just kind of out there. So a principle could be no matter what, right? I don't care if I'm 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, so you're saying once a year that they
At
reflect
least,
annually.
I mean, let's try to do it more, but
But if someone doesn't have any practice right now, they could say I could
yeah,
start there, right?
yeah, of course.
Okay. Now, okay, so here's the question. How would somebody come up with that principle? Like, how did you come up? I'm not saying that that is a principle of yours, but if it is a principle, how did that become a principle for you? How did you figure out that that's a principle?
I would say that just like it takes practice to play a sport, to become well versed with a language or a task, it's in order to be able to get to know yourself and to grow and evolve with yourself, you have to take the time to do that. And
Hmm.
so self-reflection is like practicing with your own thoughts.
Perfect. Okay, so let's say reason number one, um, our not reason, but our first step, right? So if we come up with three ways to create principles, our first one is to reflect, right? That what we're saying today in the podcast is we think it's important that our leaders, our students stop and they reflect. Why is reflection so important? I know we've talked about it already, but from your perspective, why is it so important? Why is it key, especially in this process, to figure out what your principles are?
I would say that if this leads to values, is if this leads to improvement, or if this leads to identifying anything else, self-reflection would be a good foundation because it allows you to answer questions that will come up.
Absolutely. How does a person self-reflect?
You can journal,
Hmm.
you can talk to yourself.
Yeah,
As long
absolutely.
as,
Yep. I've
yeah,
done it many
as long as
times.
you
Yep.
as long as you don't feel too crazy doing it. But you can talk to yourself, you can journal, you can seek guidance,
Mhm.
you can, uh, like we mentioned, there's therapy, there's books.
Yeah.
Many times books can make us think about new things or new perspectives. Uh, so I'd say those are good examples.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to stop and do this for the class now. So our first question for today is what is the first way that you would come up with principles? And we just talked about it, so you can go back. And then what are three ways in that? Okay. So there's one overarching word there, but then there are three ways that Katie kind of gave us right now, or more than three, but just list off three ways in that overarching theme there. How can you determine the first step and how you determine what your principles are? What would that be? Okay, so there we go. That's our first question for today. Great response there, and I actually appreciate that. That self-reflection is key. Okay, second way, and then I want to take this and just get your feedback on this. Okay, so I'll take the second way. The second way that I would say for any of us to determine, and again, I would say this to the class that you don't have to follow these three ways. We just want to give you three ways in case you're kind of lost and saying, I'm not quite sure how I find my principles. We want to offer three ways for you. So the second way, I think, for a lot of people is found in kind of that larger purpose, right? And by purpose, I don't mean your work. I don't mean what you do for a living. I don't mean that. It's more of, I guess when I say that foundational purpose is more of like the God factor is what I call it. And I'll call it a God factor because I know not everyone who comes to Point Loma is a Christian. Not everyone who comes to Point Loma. We have people who come from the Muslim background, people who come from the Jewish faith, and so. But that religious factor, that foundational factor, the God factor, the purpose factor, that could be. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Love it.
Yep. Okay. And how
Yes.
could that help us create our principles for life?
With when you say God factor, I think, like you mentioned, there's so many facets to that. For some, it could be religious faith, based, but it could also be spiritual. Uh,
It's great. Okay, explain that. Explain that. That there's a difference between religion and spirituality. Explain what that means to you. It's a great
so
point.
by strict just definition purposes, with religion, we have various religions. We have, Mormonism, Christianity, Catholicism. We have many various forms of faith from that structure. But we also have things that fall under spirituality. For some that could be nature. It could be birds hunting.
Mm,
It could be the love they see with their family and friends. It could be their relationship when they go do adventurous things like
mhm.
exercise, where they find peace, what motivates them. So with that God factor, uh, I think there's a lot to say about the root being, you mentioned something along these lines. So what is that higher purpose that
Yep.
just brings that light in your life that drives you forward?
That's
And so,
perfect. Yes. No, I think you're right. Some people find it in the pews of a church, right? Other people find it in nature, right? I don't know about you, Katie, but for me, walking is just one of the best. Like when I need to think and I need to make even business decisions, right? When I need to make a business decision or figure out where I'm going in this or create something or whatever it is, I have found that taking a long walk, there is nothing better to be inspired to come up with new ideas than there is to be out in nature. There's something about that without, and I don't turn the iPod on. iPod is that? Do people still use iPods? Is that?
I'm
I'm
sure that
dating myself right now. I don't use
you
my MP3 player. Absolutely dating myself. But I just turn off all the music, right? And it's just the walk. So I found that that's a huge way, uh, to do that. Um, okay, so what are we calling the second way to figure out our principles? Should we say religion and spirituality? Is that is that what we'll say? And people can do whatever they want in there, right?
I like
Okay.
it.
All right. So here's our second question today. Um, what's the second way to find your principles, right? So what's a second way that you could do that? And I think what Katie and I are saying, if you can find a way, some of you will go to church, you'll sit in a pew and your priest, your pastor, your imam, your faith leader will, through the book that you follow, Bible, Torah, whatever it is, you will come up with your principles for life. And that's beautiful, right? I think that's a great thing when people go to church and they can figure out that is. But others of you in the class that say, well, that's not necessarily for me, we think even just a walk out in nature or music or I like jazz music. I think there's something so spiritual about it, right? So whatever it is for you, that's where I think what Katie's saying, it's really personal to you, but we want to encourage you to do that. That's the second way. Okay, so just tell us what that is and tell us what your way is. Um, what's your way, whether it's through religion or spirituality, what's your way of finding out your principles? So that's number two. So we'll finish up with number three. And what could be the third way that people find out their principles? Katie.
Would it be appropriate to say to evaluate their priorities?
Evaluate your priority. Okay, explain what that means. I think absolutely that would be appropriate to say. Explain what that means to you.
So we mentioned how it can be very challenging to take the time to do a lot of these things. And
Yes.
so so many of us have work and, and specific to this, students have school and then not to mention family, relationships, all of the above. And so where is the time to do these things? Where is the time to reflect or to find our faith and to think about things? And so I would say that, to be successful in this journey, number three could be evaluating um, your priorities.
I
So
love it.
how are you going to make time to do these things, to accomplish your goals, to
How does someone in a practical sense, how do they evaluate their priorities? Because that is actually that's huge. And I think it sounds like you're pretty intentional with how you live your life. I'm very intentional with how I live my life. Um, but I've found that a lot of people just through busyness and all the things we have on our plate, their interests, whatever, not so much. So how does someone practically evaluate what their priorities are? That's a big one.
oh man, we could have 30 podcasts, if not more
30
on
podcasts on that one. That's right. Yeah.
there's so many ways. But if I think of a simple one, maybe one of the exercises I actually do on a weekly basis is I write down all the things I want to accomplish by the end of the week. And I have to
Yeah.
talk to myself and say, is that really doable? Are
Mm,
you going to be able to do
hmm.
all of that? So, which tasks are of the most priority? What are the things that are important? Sometimes it's easy to make those choices because they end up aligning with those values. For example, for me, it is imperative to make sure that my health is in tip-top shape, that I am taking care of my machinery so that I can be the
Yeah.
best that I can be. So
Long
for
term. That's right.
for my case, gym
Mhm.
never something I sacrifice, or uh, you know, spending time with my family,
Mhm.
not something I sacrifice. There has to be a few hours of the week for that. So at least. And so those are, things that when I find my list getting too big, I go back to, okay, am I making sure I'm prioritizing my core value?
Mhm.
So
Katie, you nailed it, because I think once we know our priorities, it helps us understand what rules we're going to make, right? And it's going to be different for different people. There might be someone in our class who's a dad, right? So the dad is going to say, I want to prioritize time with my kids 3 hours a week. Like that's a principle in my life. I prioritize my kids, right? But someone else who's not a parent, they're not going to have that same one, right? And it doesn't make it better. And I was just listening to somebody else, Joel C. Peterson. He's a business professor at Stanford University. He's got a private equity company, 3 billion assets under management. He is one of my heroes that I love to listen to. He talked about, and I think I would say this to all of us on the call today, um, on the podcast. He talked about never creating a principle or value or whatever it is that we're not willing to follow through with, right? Be honest about it. So, this is something I would tell all of us as we're creating our 7 principles, right? And our values here in a couple of weeks. Don't lie to yourself. Don't create a principle or a rule that you don't really care about. Don't do it because you think I'm going to be impressed, or your classmates are going to be impressed, or your friends, family, partner, spouse, whatever. I'd say create principles that are really true to who you are, right? And so I think when we start with our priorities, I think that is key. And then we can be honest about here's a principle. And there are certain things that will not be principles for other people because they're like, that's not a priority for me. I don't care. There are some people who don't care very much about family. It's not their thing. I keep getting all these phone calls here. I got to decline that. Some people don't care about family, right? It's not their thing. Maybe they have friendships or work or whatever. You care about family, so that's going to help determine what your principles are. Okay, so that's our third thing we want to ask you today. What's the third way that you can determine what your principles are, and what might be three of your top priorities? If you, to the extent you feel comfortable, feel free to share that. What might be your three of your top priorities? Katie, any last thoughts as we kind of exit out this podcast today? Anything you want to share with the class today?
not really, but thank you so much for having me, and a little shout out to all the students out there. Keep on grinding. You're doing great.
I love it. Keep on grinding. And I also want to say to those of you who always fast forward to the end to find the questions and answer them today, you're going to have to listen to the whole podcast. So you got to go back, and we've got 3 questions for you to answer. Those 3 questions are found within the podcast, and I can't wait to read your responses. Thanks so much. Katie, thank you so much for doing this. You are the first student that signed up and put this out there. And so I'm really excited. Today was I learned some things from you. Hope that this added value to you as well. Anybody else in the class who wants to sign up to do this is more fun than just me talking all by myself every single week. So Katie, thanks so much for doing this. Everybody
My
have a great week. Reach out if you need me. You guys take care.